All right. Hello, everybody. This is Aaron Rosari once more. This week, you read a pair of readings on a type of ethical theory known as consequentialism. Utilitarianism is the most important subtype of consequentialism. It is utilitarianism which will occupy most of our attention. I will provide answers to the reading questions you have submitted, and in the process, give a general introduction to utilitarian ethical theory. Historically speaking, there have been three highly influential utilitarian moral theorists. An early version of this theory appears in the Protagoras, which is a dialogue written by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. Plato never entertains the theory again, so this theory's brief appearance is actually a bit of an anomaly for Plato. Centuries later, the theory received its first systematic statement in defense at the hands of the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham then taught the theory to his more famous godson, John Stuart Mill. Both these philosophers lived during the Bentham lived from 1748 to 1832, and Mill lived in the 18th century. Mill's book, entitled Utilitarianism, has been the most widely read version of the theory, but professional philosophers will by and large tell you that the most philosophically interesting and plausible defense of the theory is contained in Henry Sidgwick's The Methods of Ethics, published in 1874. The most influential utilitarian writing today is Peter Singer, and our next reading that we'll cover next week comes from Singer's hand. Just want to mention at the outset that this lecture is only going to cover the first reading you did on consequentialism. The Bentham article has a lot of solid reinforcing material, but it really is reinforcing. So what I would really like you to do is carefully view or read this lecture, check your answers to your reading questions, the first three, 1 through 3, and on the last slide of this presentation, I give you a list of 5 questions, and if you can answer those questions pretty thoroughly, you have a pretty good grasp on consequentialism and utilitarianism, and that grasp will only be reinforced over the next couple of weeks as we look at more applied articles that take the theory and apply it to practical moral issues, the first being the issue of world poverty. That'll be next week, and then the issue of animal rights the following week. All right, so that's kind of our introduction. Let's go ahead and dive into those reading questions. As its name implies, consequentialism is an ethical theory which entails that the right thing to do, morally speaking, is completely determined by the consequences of one's actions. Here is Mark Timmins' extended definition. Timmins labels consequentialism C for short. And this first part, notice I've divided what Timmins actually says into a bolded part and just a normal script part. It's actually the bolded part that contains the definition of consequentialism. The rest of this is more of an explanatory background. But I'll just go ahead and read through the whole thing, and then we can unpack it. So right action is to be understood entirely in terms of the overall intrinsic value of the consequences of the action compared to the overall intrinsic value of the consequences associated with alternative actions an agent might perform instead. An action is right if and only if, and because, its consequences would be at least as good as the consequences of any alternative action that the agent might instead perform. So a good place to start uh, is by pointing out some specific features of this definition of consequentialism, and it might be useful to you to kind of take this slide and our discussion of the next slide as a set and maybe go back and forth a little bit until you have a solid understanding of, 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 uh, of the theory. Okay, so the first thing to note about Timon's definition of consequentialism is that it is rather generic. This definition of right action merely tells us that the right thing to do is determined by the consequences of acting in one way as opposed to another. We are not told what exactly counts as a good consequence and what counts as a bad consequence. This is intentional on Timon's part, as he is merely introducing consequentialism as a broad type of ethical theory. When we transition from the generic consequentialism to the far more specific utilitarianism, we will specify what counts as a good and bad consequence. Even though this definition is generic, we do learn a lot about ethical theories which come under this category. Have you ever heard the phrase, "the ends justify the means"? This phrase applies rather well to consequentialist thinking. On a consequentialist view, types of actions which are usually wrong, such as lying and stealing, can be the right thing to do on a particular occasion if lying or stealing on that occasion produces more good consequences than bad for the group affected by that action. Hence, stealing your drunk friend's car keys or stealing to feed yourself and others constitutes a right action, assuming that the good consequences outweigh the bad. A third point to make about consequentialism is that the consequentialist does not care very much about one's motives. For example, one could be giving roses to her sick grandmother for the selfish reason of wanting to get a bigger inheritance. One might not care about grandma's well-being at all. The consequentialist does not figure the quality of one's motive into her calculations. The consequentialist only wants to know if more benefits than harms result from the giving of the roses. Similarly, the consequentialist does not think too much about human rights. I'm going to qualify that, but let's run with it for a second. Consider property rights. So when I lived in Brooklyn, many residents were forced to sell their property to a developer named Bruce Ratner so that the Barclays Center, which is an enormous sporting and concert venue, could be built. The city justified this on consequentialist grounds. The argument was that the Barclays Center would be an economic boon to the entire borough. The fact that residents would be forced to move does count as a bad consequence, but on this theory, the residents lacked an inalienable or unoverridable right to their property. The bad or harm done to those forced to move was simply outweighed by the benefits to the whole borough. Similarly, the consequentialist would think that sacrificing an innocent life to save many lives is the right thing to do as long as the net good consequences outweighed the bad. Now, there is a sense in which the consequentialist believes in a kind of human right. We'll get there when we talk about impartiality. Everybody's pain and suffering must be factored in to the calculus when deciding what to do. But if a lot of people were to greatly benefit, or if great harms would be prevented to a large group by allowing a smaller group or an individual to suffer, the consequentialist tends to be on board with such an action. Competing theories of ethics would not be on board, and we'll cover two of those theories: the theory of Immanuel Kant, and then John Rawls' theory of justice later on in the semester. So you'll get a nice contrast to this approach. Okay, now let's look at the notion of intrinsic value. On page 7, Timmons states that consequentialist moral theory is a value-based moral theory that defines right action in terms of intrinsic value. What does it mean when one says that an outcome has intrinsic value? The relevant contrast term for intrinsic value is instrumental value. Consider the following two definitions. First definition: an outcome has intrinsic value means the outcome is good in and of itself. Second definition: an outcome has instrumental value. This means the outcome brings about a further outcome which is good in and of itself. So it's good as a kind of means to an end. Right now I want to talk about good outcomes at a very common sense level. When we get to utilitarianism, and especially hedonistic utilitarianism, we can talk about these things in a more precise way. For now, let's imagine a person, possibly yourself, who hates getting up early in the morning. For that person, again, possibly you, possibly me, getting up early is not an outcome with intrinsic value. But you might be getting up early to go to work, get an education, exercise, or meet up with a friend. Those further outcomes are good in and of themselves, and hence have intrinsic value. And I can qualify this a little. If those further goods, like say exercise, isn't something you enjoy in and of itself, then even that could itself be have instrumental value, as it would lead to increased health, which would be the good that ultimately has intrinsic value. So back to our little scenario. Getting up early on this scenario would have merely instrumental value for the person who detests such early rising. Now, when Timmons says the consequentialist thinks that right action is determined by the intrinsic value of the outcomes of an action in comparison with relevant alternative actions, what he basically has in mind here is that what you do is you take whatever consequences of an action have intrinsic value, and you kind of quantify those consequences. And then you subtract intrinsically bad outcomes, or outcomes that have intrinsic disvalue. And then you compare the net result with the sum total of good and bad consequences of competing alternative actions. And that's more or less how the consequentialist figures out what the right thing to do is. Now, it's worth noting, and I think I've actually noted it once already, that not all ethical theories go about figuring out what is right based solely on what is valuable. For example, a libertarian, which is a kind of political theorist, cares about people having the freedom to pursue what they want in life, but the libertarian does not think we have an obligation to set social policy in a manner which maximizes good outcomes for the people in that society. Hence, on this competing theory, one could be doing the right thing, even if the laws and policies being acted upon are not likely to produce the best outcomes for a society as a whole. Similarly, one might think one has a basic duty to refrain from any type of lying, killing, or stealing, even if doing so would result in worse outcomes. Hence, this basing what is right strictly on what is valuable is somewhat unique to consequentialism. Now, Timmons notes that not only is the right thing to do based on the value of the outcomes of competing actions, he emphasizes that the goal of the consequentialist is to maximize good consequences and minimize the bad ones. This is what he means when he says that consequentialism is a maximizing theory. Again, most ethical theories are not like this. Not only does one have a moral responsibility to avoid intentionally harming others on this view, that's pretty common to most theories, one also has a responsibility to act for the common good. For example, consequentialism entails that we ought to give away much of the disposable income we have to others who are in desperate need, as this would maximize the good consequences, less hunger and deprivation, related to spending that money. If I would only lose a good and tasty sandwich whilst providing another with basic medicine, shelter, or food, then the consequentialist thinks I am morally obligated to do this. We will further explore this thought next week in relation to Peter Singer's utilitarian arguments regarding giving to the world's poor. Timmons also notes that consequentialism demands a high degree of impartiality. What this means is that everyone's interests in experiencing good outcomes and avoiding bad ones count equally. So I'm not allowed to favor myself, my family and friends, or my country for that matter, when I am trying to discern the right thing to do. To be impartial simply means to not show any favoritism. This brings us back to the idea that the right thing to do is the action which has the most benefits and least deficiencies for the entire group which is affected by an action. The basic impulse towards impartiality, which is a kind of fairness, is a good one. When I'm grading your tests and essays, it really shouldn't matter to me who the author is. I should only be concerned with the quality of your work and not with whose work it is. Similarly, when society makes laws, those laws should take everyone's interests equally into account. There shouldn't be any discrimination or bias based on race, religion, gender, or social status. Yet, many critics of utilitarianism and consequentialism thinks the utilitarian slash consequentialist takes impartiality a bit too far. So, for example, one might think I ought to do more to protect the welfare of my own family, especially my kids, than I ought to do in order to protect the welfare of other people. Similar thoughts apply to one's friends and family in a variety of situations. We will have opportunity to explore this line of thinking in detail next week. So let me just recap that a little. So all ethical theories that are remotely plausible advocate a certain level of impartiality, a certain level of counting people's interests as equally valid. But the consequentialist takes this line of thinking really far. So not only is everyone in the world of equal value, the utilitarian holds that we have equal levels of responsibility towards everyone. Now that second thought, that we have equal responsibility towards everyone, actually doesn't follow strictly from the first thought that everybody is of equal value. And again, we'll explore that next week in relation to the Singer article when we try to figure out the levels of duty we have, even to perfect strangers. Okay, now, let's move on. As I have mentioned earlier, utilitarianism is a more specific form of consequentialism. Utilitarianism is a more specific theory because the utilitarian offers us a definition of good and bad consequences. Uh, so our generic consequentialist theory just tells us the right thing to do is determined by kind of weighing the good and bad consequences of competing actions. When we make the jump to utilitarianism, the jump is made by developing a more specific account of what good and bad consequences are. So Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill both thought that human welfare or happiness was the only thing in the whole universe which was of intrinsic value. Hence, when we evaluate the consequences of an action in order to determine if they are good or bad, we only need to take the effects of an action on human well-being into account. So this is Timmins' kind of summary of Bentham and Mill. And I'm just going to point out, but we're not going to make much of it now, that Timmins has made an error here regarding Jeremy Bentham's views. Bentham, in fact, also considered animal well-being, as he was an early animal rights activist in the sense that he defended humane treatment of animals in print, and he did so using utilitarian theory. But let us pass over this for now. We will address utilitarian applications to animal rights in a couple weeks. So with this caveat in mind, let us take a look at what a utilitarian principle of right action looks like, so we can compare it to the more generic consequentialist principle we have already discussed. Question 2b inquires, what is the utility of an action and how is it calculated? The utility of an action is more or less the amount of happiness the action is expected to cause minus the amount of unhappiness it is likely or expected to cause. This is best illustrated by example. Let us suppose that during World War II, a German soldier has arrived at your house and he is inquiring as to whether or not you are hiding Jewish refugees. Let's say you are. You have a choice to make. You can tell the truth or you can lie and say that you are not. In order to figure out the best thing to do from a utilitarian perspective, you must calculate the intrinsic value of the likely outcomes of each course of action. If you tell the truth, the Jewish refugee will be imprisoned and is likely to slowly starve to death until being killed. You are also likely to be arrested yourself. Hence, there are an enormous number of bad consequences which are almost certain to follow if you tell the truth, and very few benefits. Maybe the soldiers will be happy to have found you out. But that's about it for the positive effects. In contrast, lying is likely to preserve the life and freedom of your refugee and yourself, with almost no downside. Hence, the utility of lying, the effects on human happiness, far exceeds the utility of telling the truth in this circumstance. We have noted prior that utilitarianism is a more specific form of consequentialism. Utilitarianism takes on this more specific form by offering us a definition of what counts as a good and as a bad consequence. Consider Timmins' initial formulation of utilitarianism. An action is right if and only if and because it would likely produce at least as high a utility, which is a net overall balance of welfare or well-being or happiness, as would any other alternative action one might perform instead. Okay, so as you can see, the utilitarian replaces the good and bad consequences component of the definition of consequentialism with the more specific notion of utility, which is defined as net overall balance of welfare. This net overall balance is the sum of all the happiness and unhappiness experienced by each individual that is affected by the action. See the prior slide and attendant commentary for a refresher on utility and how it's calculated. Now, utilitarianism can take on even more specific forms by giving an even more specific definition of utility. This rather generic U defines utility in terms of human welfare. The more specific version of utilitarianism we're about to look at offers us a definition of human welfare in terms of pleasures and pains. This version, which was defended by both Bentham and Mill, is referred to as hedonistic utilitarianism. To this version, we will now turn. As noted, both Bentham and Mill were value hedonists. A value hedonist is one who argues that the quality of one's life, one's well-being, or happiness is a function of the pleasures and pains one experiences. On this view, only pleasures are of intrinsic value and only pains are of intrinsic disvalue. Hence, if one wants to figure out how well a person's life is going, one need only add up the pleasures and subtract the pains, and one will have the utility of that person's life. Similarly, if one wants to figure out the utility of an action, all one needs to do is add up the pleasures caused to everyone who is affected by that action and subtract the pains caused to everyone who is affected by that action. This last thought is encapsulated in the definition of hedonistic utilitarianism. An action is right if and only if and because it would likely produce at least as high a net balance of pleasure or less pain as would any other alternative one might do instead. The main virtue of hedonistic utilitarianism is that it is easy to apply, at least compared to other forms of utilitarianism. It is worth noting that the word pleasure takes on a very broad meaning in this context. The relational pleasures of love and friendship, the intellectual pleasures associated with learning and problem solving, artistic pleasures, and bodily pleasures are all included in the set of pleasures which have intrinsic value. This is important to note because when we hear the word pleasure, we tend to think of the more bodily or animal pleasures. The value hedonist does not do this. So when they're calculating the utility of the action, the net balance of pleasures versus pains, they're taking a broad range of pleasures into account, such as those types listed here. Now, question 3 asks about two other forms of consequentialism. These two other forms are perfectionist consequentialism. An action is right if and only if and because it would likely bring about a greater balance of perfectionist goods than would any alternative action one might perform instead. And rule consequentialism. An action is right if and only if it is required by a rule whose consequences are best. These views are less influential than hedonistic utilitarianism, so I will just briefly describe them here. The perfectionist consequentialist, PC for short, is struck by the fact that many unpleasant or painful experiences lead to great achievements and the cultivation of various human excellences, such as intellectual, artistic, and athletic achievements. These human excellences are what is of intrinsic value on this theory. This view competes with the hedonistic utilitarian view that states of pleasure and pain are the things of intrinsic value. Now, rule consequentialism, which can be easily modified into a form of utilitarianism by defining good consequences of states of pleasures and avoidance of pain, is a form of consequentialism which is more concerned with the consequences or utility of following a general rule. The best way to understand this view is to contrast it with hedonistic utilitarianism, which has a focus on evaluating specific actions. The rule utilitarian may very well think that do not lie is an excellent general rule to follow because following this rule leads to better consequences than following any other rule. The hedonistic utilitarian, by contrast, evaluates the decision to lie or tell the truth on a case-by-case basis. Hence, the two theories may yield different results. But then again, they might not. This is because the rule consequentialist may discover that obeying the following rule produces the best consequences. Do not lie unless telling the truth will result in great harm. This rule would entail acting in a manner much more consistent with how the hedonistic utilitarian wants us to act. Hence, depending on what rule yields the best consequences, rule utilitarianism may or may not yield different advice than what hedonistic utilitarianism yields. Okay. Now I'm going to end the lecture here. The Bentham reading is a nice supplement to the consequentialist reading and serves to reinforce many of the themes covered by that first reading. Having said that, focusing on mastering the material covered in the first three reading questions and this lecture is your best strategy going forward. This lecture contains a lot of vocabulary. Hence, if you can perform the following tasks, you are doing quite well. If you can't, you may want to review this lecture, and you might want to switch it up if you've just got done listening to it. Maybe read it. If you're reading it, maybe view it. But if you can't answer these 5 questions, you might want to review the lecture and the answers to your first 3 reading questions one more time and email me any follow-up questions. So here are the questions I want you to be able to answer. Explain why utilitarianism is a more specific version of consequentialism. What is more specific about it? Explain why hedonistic utilitarianism is a more specific version of utilitarianism. What is more specific about it? So these two together take us from the very generic consequentialism to the more specific utilitarianism to the more specific hedonistic utilitarianism, and it's important that you can say why these theories are different. You should also be able to define value hedonism. You should know the answer to this question: what are some categories of pleasures that the value hedonist recognizes as being of intrinsic value? And finally, and might even be the most important here, how would a hedonistic utilitarian calculate the utility of an action? And you'll have an opportunity to practice doing that on the discussion board. All right, email me any questions. Make sure you can answer these 5 questions, and you're good to go.